The one thing common to all of us is common sense. It comes as standard equipment with every human being. Some have suggested that certain people are simply absent of it. I believe this to be a mistaken conclusion. The issue is rarely whether common sense exists, but how it is employed. There are three ways in which common sense can be used. It may be followed, it may be ignored, it may be tainted by pride, prejudice, passion, ideology, or self-interest. The capacity for common sense is one thing. The willingness to heed it is quite another. Coming to you from the MAB Podcast Network, this is On The Brink with Michael Allen Brown. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this new edition of On the Brink. There is an expression that we've probably all used at one time or another. We shake our heads at something that someone has said, and we say to ourselves, some people just don't have any common sense. I've said it. You've probably said it. And there are certain moments when the evidence seems pretty convincing. But lately I've been thinking about that statement, and I've come to a somewhat different conclusion. I don't believe common sense is absent. I believe it comes as standard equipment. Every model, every year, every one of us. The question isn't whether we possess common sense. The question is, what do we do with it? And I believe there are basically three possibilities. We can follow it, we can ignore it, or we can taint it. And there's a very important difference between the three. Let's begin with the easiest one first. Common sense followed. You're driving down the highway. The dark clouds begin gathering ahead. Rain starts falling. Visibility decreases. The speed limit may still say 70 miles an hour. But common sense tells you, slow down. Nobody had to pass another law. Nobody had to put up another sign. Nobody had to pull you over. You looked at the circumstances, evaluated the danger, and made the sensible decision. That's common sense. A child reaches toward a hot stove, and the parent says, "Don't touch that. It'll burn you." Eventually, the child learns something that will serve him for the rest of his life. Heat burns. Sharp things cut. Ice is slippery. Actions have consequences. And as we grow older, the circumstances become more complicated. But the principle doesn't really change. If you spend more money than you earn, eventually you're going to have financial problems. If you don't maintain your automobile, eventually something is going to break. If someone has demonstrated repeatedly that he cannot be trusted, handing him your life savings probably isn't a good idea. Common sense doesn't require a doctorate. It doesn't require an advanced mathematical formula. Much of the time, it simply requires looking at what is in front of us, considering what we already know, and acting accordingly. And here's something we rarely think about. Civilization depends upon people doing this millions of times every day. We stop at red lights. We stand in line. We keep our promises. We return things that don't belong to us. We warn someone when we see danger. We help a stranger who has fallen. Nobody applauds. Nobody gives us a medal. Most of these decisions never make the evening news. They're simply ordinary people following common sense. But when we come to the second category, common sense ignored, this one is different. Because here we know better. The common sense is still there. We simply choose not to listen to it. You're driving down the interstate, your phone alerts you to a text message coming in, and you know perfectly well that taking your eyes off the road is dangerous. Common sense says, leave that phone alone. But another voice says, it'll only take a second. So you look. That's not an absence of common sense. Common sense was working perfectly. You simply ignored it. Someone has been told repeatedly by his doctor that he needs to change a destructive habit. He understands the warning. He knows the potential consequences. He may even agree completely with the doctor. And then he walks out the door and continues doing exactly what he was doing before. Common sense wasn't missing. It was ignored. Or consider something even simpler. You say something in anger. Almost immediately, something inside you says, you shouldn't have said that. You know it. The other person knows it. Everybody in the room knows it. Common sense now tells you, apologize. 2 words could begin repairing the damage. I'm sorry. But pride enters the room. And suddenly those 2 little words become almost impossible to say. Again, common sense wasn't absent. It was overruled. And that brings us to what I believe is the most dangerous of the 3. Common sense tainted. Because sometimes we don't merely ignore common sense. Sometimes we contaminate it. We allow something else to interfere with our ability to evaluate what should otherwise be obvious. Pride can do it. Greed can do it. Fear can do it. Anger can do it. Prejudice can do it. Political loyalty can do it. Ideology can do it. Personal ambition can do it. Self-interest can do it. And when that happens, something fascinating occurs. We begin using our intelligence to explain away what our common sense has already told us. Suppose a businessman discovers that something in his company is not being done quite right. His first instinct tells him this isn't ethical. There's the common sense. But then he begins thinking about the money, the quarterly report, the promotion, the shareholders. And pretty soon he's constructed an elaborate explanation for why something he originally knew was wrong really isn't wrong after all. His common sense hasn't disappeared. It has been tainted by self-interest. Or consider politics. A public official from the party that we oppose does something unquestionably wrong. We immediately recognize it. That's wrong. But then a politician from our own side does essentially the same thing. And suddenly we're searching for explanations. Well, that's different. Oh, there's more context. Well, we have to understand the circumstances. Maybe there is. Sometimes circumstances really are different. But sometimes we are simply applying two different standards. And if our judgment of right and wrong changes according to the name printed beside the political party, we ought to at least ask ourselves whether common sense has become tainted by tribal loyalty. That applies to conservatives. It applies to liberals. It applies to Republicans. It applies to Democrats. And it certainly applies to independents. Because none of us is immune. There's another danger here. Education doesn't necessarily protect us from this. Intelligence doesn't necessarily protect us from it either. In fact, sometimes intelligence can make the problem worse. Because a very intelligent person can become remarkably skilled at constructing sophisticated arguments to justify something his common sense warned him against from the very start. There is a difference between intelligence, knowledge, and wisdom. Knowledge tells us what we can do. Intelligence may tell us how to do it. But wisdom asks, should we do it? And very often, common sense already knows the answer. Now here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because it's very easy to listen to an episode like this and start thinking of other people. We all know somebody who ignores common sense. We can probably think of several, but that's not really the point. The more useful question is, what category am I in? When the evidence contradicts something that I want to believe, do I follow the evidence? Or do I search for an excuse to dismiss it? When somebody offers criticism, do I consider he might be right? Or does pride immediately build a defensive wall when I make a mistake? Do I admit it? When experience has repeatedly demonstrated that something doesn't work, do I change course? Or do I continue doing the same thing while expecting a different outcome? Those aren't questions for Washington. They're not questions for corporate America. They're not questions for the fellow down the street. They're questions for me and for you. Perhaps that's why common sense is such an interesting phrase. We call it common sense, not exceptional sense, not elite sense, not specialized sense. Common, something ordinary, something accessible, something woven into the everyday human experience. Standard equipment. But having equipment and using it are two entirely different things. You can have headlights and drive in the dark without turning them on. You can have brakes and refuse to use them. You can have a compass and deliberately walk in the opposite direction. The equipment was there. The failure came in what we did with it. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Maybe when we look around our society and wonder, whatever happened to common sense, we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps common sense didn't go anywhere. Perhaps it is still sitting exactly where it has always been, waiting to be consulted, waiting to be heard, waiting to be followed. The challenge isn't acquiring it. The challenge is having enough humility, enough discipline, and sometimes enough courage to listen to it. So the next time you're tempted to say, that person doesn't have any common sense, maybe consider another possibility. Maybe he has it. Maybe I have it. Maybe you have it. Maybe we all received it as standard equipment. But every day, in decisions large and small, we decide what we're going to do with it. We can follow it, we can ignore it, or we can taint it. And perhaps the measure of wisdom isn't whether we possess common sense, but whether we're willing to follow it, even when common sense tells us something we don't want to hear. I'm Michael Brown, and this is On The Brink.